Hi, everyone. Liz and I are back today with a very special guest. This is Miss Megan Lundstrom, who is from the Avery Center. So, Megan, can you introduce yourself to us and tell us a little bit about your background and your organization and what you do?
Sure. So my name is Megan Lundstrom. I am the co-founder and director of research at the Avery Center, and I love to frame kind of who I am and what I do through an equation because I love formulas. This formula defines expertise in a specific field, and it is exposure, education, and experience. Exposure is firsthand lived experience. And so I hold firsthand lived experience as a survivor of domestic sex trafficking and commercial sexual exploitation. Education can be both formal and informal education. And I can definitely consider myself a lifelong learner. I love reading. I love learning everything I can get my hands on. Formally, I have an undergrad in finance and a master's in sociology, both from the University of Northern Colorado. And then experience is this final component, which is just this traditional workplace experience. And so I originally founded the Avery Center back in 2014 and have been involved in anti-trafficking work since then. So for the last 7 years.
That is awesome. And I know that one of the things that your organization is big on is research,
Yes.
right? And so that was sort of what drew Liz and I to you. So before I get into, or I have you get into what you're going to be speaking to us about today, one of the ways that I found you was through, I had mentioned to you, I was looking at a post of Rebecca Bender's, and the topic that she was speaking on is something that people have a hard time understanding is if someone is not physically confined or chained up, then why can't they just walk away? And
Mhm.
she mentioned you and your work and research around the idea of the similarities between human trafficking and cult theory. And
Yes.
that was just like, oh my gosh, we need to hear about this. So that is what we would like for you to speak to us about today. So can
Sure.
you introduce that topic to us and just help us understand that whole formula?
Sure. Yeah, I was going to say, in addition to formulas, I also love stories, which is why being a researcher is great because I get to hear the stories and collect data at the same time and allow the data to tell stories and vice versa.
Brene
Um,
Brown says that stories are data with a soul.
yes, Brene Brown is like my hero. She's goals. She is just career goals to me.
Yes.
I feel like she has totally revamped. Like a lot of people, when they hear research or data, they're like, "Oh my gosh, boring." Brene's brought like such energy and passion to it that I feel like it's research is kind of having this surge right now where people are
Yeah.
understanding the importance and like how much depth you can have to data.
Mm-hmm.
So really my entree into cultic theory research started. I was maybe a year or two exited from my trafficking situation. Really at that point did not identify as a survivor of trafficking. I knew I had been involved in prostitution. I knew I had been arrested. I knew I had a pimp, but I had a boyfriend. Like I didn't know what he was. And so really just trying to make sense of my own experiences. But one of the big things that my traffickers had used over me was the power of secrecy. And so having moved back to my hometown, I really felt like I needed to speak my truth. I needed to tell what had actually happened to me. Because there were a lot of rumors, there was a lot of assumptions. And even trying to access services, I was viewed as a criminal, not a victim. And so I didn't qualify for any services. So all of those things, I kind of was like, I want to tell my story. I want to get out there and tell people my story. So I ended up going to this event and spoke on trafficking that happens in the oil fields specifically. That was a part of my lived experience, and my hometown was going through an oil boom at the time. And I could see that our community was not prepared for what was happening. And so this woman came up to me afterwards and she said, "I'd love to take you out for lunch. I really want to hear your story," which that's another topic, ethical storytelling and re-exploitation of survivors. But the other piece of that is I did go to lunch with her, and I was really excited because I thought somebody's going to listen to me, somebody's going to understand. And so I started to tell her chronologically my journey. And I watched this look of disappointment come over her face. And she said, "Oh, I am really glad that you started making better choices. That wasn't trafficking." And I'm sitting in this restaurant like, I I don't even know what to do right now. Like, I had done some like vision casting that morning and was manifesting, and I was like, this is not what I had been envisioned at all. Um, and so at that point I was like, oh my gosh, I need to get out of here. Like, I need the Staples, like, the red button that they push in the Staples commercials. Like, I need a solution. I don't know what to do. Um, and so she said, well, I just don't understand. If you weren't chained up, why didn't you just leave? And in my head,
There
I'm
it
thinking,
is. There's that question,
yep,
right?
yes. So in my head, I'm thinking like, I don't really know either. Like, I'm actually in therapy trying to untangle that right now.
Yeah.
Um, and and so I kind of made a flippant comment because I was really at that point just like, I need to get out of here.
Yeah.
This is not a supportive environment for me. And so I just told her, well, it's kind of like a cult. You get brainwashed into a belief system, and then you start to believe that like that's all you're good for. And that kind of helped like flip the switch in her head a little bit of like, oh, it's not just about physical restraints like chains and duct tape. So I went home, and thankfully, like I said, I had a really great therapist at the time. My family didn't really understand what had happened to me either, but they were very supportive of where I was at. So I had kind of this healthy safety net to process with. And as I processed, I realized I really want to continue sharing my story and educating my community, but she's probably not going to be the last person that says something like that. And I don't think that she was coming from a place of being malicious. She just didn't know. She watched the movie Taken like the rest of us, and what I described to her was not that. And so she didn't have a frame of reference for what I was talking about. So as much as her words hurt, I also understand like she was coming from a place of good intentions. She just didn't know. And so then I started thinking about, well, what kind of a framework can I provide people? Is there a series of steps that people get into trafficking, or something along those lines that I can really like teach people the pieces of? And so I thought, well, this reference to cults seemed to make sense for her. So maybe that'll work for other people. So I did a Google search of cult characteristics and found this website that has the 15 cult characteristics. These have now kind of been revamped into another model called a BITE model, BITE, but originally it was these 15 characteristics. And so I started reading through it. And just as I'm reading through this web page, I'm going, that happened to me, and I can think of 10 examples. This happened to me, and I can think of 10 examples. This happened to me, and I can think of, X number of examples for me. And I also can think of like 10 things that I witnessed other victims experiencing. And so I went through those 15, and I was like, oh my gosh, I can teach people through this framework of cultic theory. And so that was kind of, it's one of those like bittersweet moments of like, that woman actually gets credit for putting me on this path to find cultic theory and figuring out how do I communicate this to people. So that's where things started. And since then, I mean, I spent several years reading every single book, article, journal publication, attending cult recovery conferences, all kinds of stuff. And just kind of devouring everything I could get my hands on to better understand things through this lens. And then at the same time, collecting data and feedback and experiences from survivors that I was walking alongside through the Avery Center, and seeing those same patterns again. And so that's kind of where we're at now with the Avery Center uses that as one of our core foundational frameworks for service delivery. It's a piece of everything that we do now. So that's kind of the story behind cultic theory and how it came to be. And I'd love to talk more about the specifics.
Yes.
That might be helpful.
could you briefly kind of walk us through what those characteristics are and how the two are similar and very closely related? And then also, I wanted to ask you, um, this model can be used both to explain the experience of the victim, but it's also used to explain the tools and the tactics that a trafficker uses to manipulate or coerce someone, correct?
Yes, I mean, it's such a fascinating model, and we're actually in the process of even applying it to why commercial sex buyers buy sex,
Mm,
and the community that they create that helps normalize their behaviors.
got it.
Yeah, so which is also super interesting. So
Yeah.
it's so applicable in so many ways. Excuse me. So yeah, so I can walk you through these, and
Yeah.
I'll kind of unpack just a couple of them.
Okay.
Um, so the first one is the group displays an excessively zealous and unquestioning commitment to its leader and regards their belief system, ideology, and practices as the truth. And so anyone who has experienced trafficking or worked with a victim or a survivor of trafficking knows that there is this, essentially, it's a trauma bond between the trafficker and their victim. But what that comes across as is just this absolute loyalty for their abuser. Number two is questioning, doubt, and dissent are discouraged or even punished, which goes back into this ultimate ultimate authority of the trafficker, and then this loyalty and dedication of the victim. So a lot of victims over time just learn to stop asking questions, stop pushing back, stop coming up with suggestions. I know the term is, outdated now. There's another term and I'm drawing a blank, but essentially learned helplessness.
Mhm.
When you are beaten and humiliated and discouraged and starved and sleep deprived, you stop doing the things to get that punishment, and you learn to just depend on your abuser. So mind-altering practices are used in excess to suppress doubts about the group and its leaders. So this can be substances, sleep deprivation, listening to the same songs over and over and over again, the same movies over and over again. And it basically just drowns out your ability to think critically. And there's so much research around sleep deprivation and what it can do to your brain in the short term and long term. And so making victims work around the clock is a really easy way to just create that mind altered state.
Mhm.
Number four is the leadership dictates, sometimes in great detail, how members should think, act, and feel. So this can be what to wear, where to live, whether to have children, how to discipline children, all of those different things. They may have to get permission to have a relationship. They may be forbidden to have relationships, to move across the country, all of those things. The trafficker ultimately has the say in every single thing. And so again, we see this kind of at those larger levels of who you can talk to and where you can live, but we also see it within pimp culture specifically of what clothing is acceptable to wear, where you can go get your nails done, how often you should have your car cleaned. Everything has rules, particularly within pimp controlled sex trafficking. The next one is the group is elitist, claiming a special exalted status for itself, its leaders, and its members. And that one folds right in with the next one, which is the group has a polarized us versus them mentality. So believing this belief that I'm better than everybody who doesn't know this secret. That's what's taught oftentimes, and my experience centers in pimp controlled trafficking. So that's why I refer to it a lot. But we see these characteristics within familial and gang trafficking as well. But this belief of I'm better than everybody that doesn't know this secret, and everybody else, there's something that's there's a like it's not working right in the world, and we've figured out this way to get to win the rat race, essentially.
Mhm.
Those fold in. Again, there's so much overlap between
Yeah.
these. So the next one is The leader is not accountable to any authorities. Um, so, for example, like teachers, military commanders, ministers, law enforcement, like everybody has to answer to somebody. Traffickers truly do not believe that they are accountable. And unfortunately, what we see with our criminal justice system is oftentimes like they're not.
Mhm.
We're seeing traffickers sentenced to 6 months or 2 years for, a decade of horrific abuse. And that just reinforces that they aren't accountable. They get a slap on the wrist and they can continue on doing what they're doing.
Yeah.
The next one is kind of ties back into this us versus them mentality, which is the group teaches or implies that its supposedly exalted ends justify whatever means it deems necessary. And so this results in members participating in behaviors or activities they would have considered reprehensible or unethical. And so we think about the social stigmas around prostitution, but also theft, substance abuse. There's a whole list of other behaviors and trauma coping skills that kind of crop up with trafficking specifically.
Mhm.
The next one is the leadership induces feelings of shame or guilt to influence and control members. And this is often done through peer pressure and subtle forms of persuasion. So there's absolutely overt force, fraud, and coercion that's happening at the hands of the trafficker against their victim. But you also have trafficking situations are actually structured, like their organizational chart is structured in ways where peers actually pressure one another, and it's designed that way intentionally. So within a pimp controlled structure, you have a person that's referred to as a bottom, and she is unfortunately a lot of times charged as a co-facilitator as with the trafficker. The
Mhm.
reality is that she is one of his victims, and she's often the most abused and manipulated of the victims. But a lot of times traffickers have the bottom make hotel reservations in their name, open bank accounts in their name, drive other victims around, collect money from them. So they're actually doing all of the things that are defined and constitute as trafficking. This bottom is the one that's carrying it out. The trafficker has done that on purpose. So these feelings of shame or guilt are often carried out by that bottom. And then within that org chart, again, like those victims, traffickers create situations to make victims fight amongst themselves. And so you have this kind of horizontal violence that's happening in that space where victims are competing with one another, they're fighting with one another, but it's all because it's been instigated by that trafficker, which then ultimately benefits the trafficker because all of their victims are focused on and competing amongst each other instead of looking at the bigger situation of what's going on. The next two is about preoccupation. So the group is preoccupied with bringing in new members, and the group is preoccupied with making money, which I feel like those two right there pretty much summarize pimp controlled trafficking kind of in a nutshell. Constantly recruiting because there is a lot of, for lack of a better term, turnover. So victims go to jail. They're bought by other traffickers, they escape, they go back home, like whatever's happening, they go to rehab, all of these different things. And so traffickers have to constantly be recruiting, and they also expect their victims to also be constantly recruiting. And so again, that preoccupation with making money. So there's a lot of just I don't know what the term is, institutionalized capitalism, like it's just embodied in them of this desire to make money and the feeling of if I'm sitting still, if I'm resting, if I'm not actively pursuing some type of means that's going to bring in income, then I shouldn't be spending time on it. Which is really one of the biggest pieces when exiting. That's really hard to deprogram from that piece because we live in a capitalist society, and that's just kind of ingrained in our culture anyways, that we need to be
Yeah.
work, do. And so trafficking survivors, myself included, really struggle with that piece of just shutting off and like sitting, like I watched Netflix all day yesterday, and that's really hard for me to do that. So the next one is members are expected to devote inordinate amounts of time to the group and group related activities. Pretty self-explanatory. Members are encouraged or required to live with or socialize only with other group members. And then the last one, this is one of my like most hope-filled ones. The statement itself is kind of depressing, but it lends to this bigger picture. So the final characteristic is the most loyal members feel there can be no life outside of the context of the group. They believe there's no way to be and often fear reprisals to themselves or others if they leave or even consider leaving the group. So I'll ask you two, are you familiar with M. Night Shyamalan's The Village, the movie?
I think so. I
Came
think
out like,
so.
Yeah, that's the one when the villagers are scaring the other villagers with the
yes,
costume to keep them in the village.
yes. So that's my favorite kind of analogy to give folks to better understand what this looks like. So anybody that's listening has not seen it, I'd encourage them to go watch it because, as you said, the monsters that are in the forest are actually the elders of this village, and they're creating this perception that there's really scary things to keep the younger community members in that community and from going out anywhere else into the world. And so that same thing happens in trafficking situations where traffickers are the ones that are breeding this fear and they're leveraging and exploiting vulnerabilities. And then ultimately, like that's terrifying to fight through that forest. And oftentimes in the process of fighting through, you realize that it's actually the trafficker that's creating these. It's the trafficker that's the monster. They're not protecting you from the monster. They are the monster. And so this last one I love talking about because I think it's one of many reasons why it's so important to have survivor leaders that are able and interested, I will say that piece, in being public with their experiences. Because there is no better way to build rapport. There is no better way to kind of plant those seeds in a current victim's life than for them to see exited survivors who are happy, healthy, thriving. They have a strong support system. They have a family of choice. They have living wage employment. They have safe and affordable housing. All of those pieces are ultimately what is a huge motivator for current victims because they're seeing that. And it can be really hard when you're in that community to see outside of it and to believe that anything else is possible.
By
So
design, right?
yes, yep. So those are the 15 characteristics.
Wow. So Liz likes to say life after the life, right?
Yes.
And that's what a survivor leader can do, is to show someone, a current victim, that there is possibility for a good life after leaving the life.
Yes.
And I love that you end it on that note, because that is so important. I do have a couple questions, but before I ask, Liz, do you have any comments or questions?
No, I would say more so comments. I think it's important for people to really understand and to kind of hone it in to our parenting program, right? Like our environment is really critical to what choices, as the girl said, that you went to lunch with, the choices that we make, right? So because this is what we talk about too, me and Jamie have talked about with victim services in general too. You can't heal in environments that are very similar to the environment that you came from. And people have a hard time understanding one that like, oh, well, you have the opportunity, just come back to your, sister's house where your trafficker recruited you out of or whatever, groomed you from. But that may not work, right? Because maybe there was some dysfunction in sister's house that allowed this vulnerability for me to be groomed by this trafficker. So I think it's really important for parents to understand that environment is critical, and we have to be aware of how both of these things correlate with each other. I know that we oftentimes, when I've done trainings before too, that big misconception of people chained and forced by physical things, or even like gorilla pimping in general, that all pimps are gorilla pimps. It really kind of hurts the movement of human trafficking in a lot of ways, because that's just not what it happens, but that's just not what we see here in the United States. And then there's also, I've had conversations with people where if it's not that forced thing, it's like, well, that only happens in the Philippines or Cambodia or these other countries, and people really refuse to see things that are happening here. But I also think that's because too, and to speak to your point you made about when you're talking a little bit about, you know, how when you left the life that you were seen as a criminal, and that goes a lot to the way we see prostitution in general, right? Because if you're the other person, and I've had discussions with people too, well, you know, it's not my husband's fault, it's this temptation of these prostitutes. Or, you know, when they're married, it's like, well, if they weren't out there stripping or dancing or doing these things, then my husband wouldn't cheat. And it really gives, and we talk about Johns in our thing, Johns these out as well.
Yes.
For the choices that they're making, because they are the demand, right? And they're not held accountable. And then we demonize women and men. I've worked mostly with women, so women and men that are really forced to engage in these things. So I love that you tie it to a cult, because it truly is. People truly don't understand that, like, you're not supposed to be talking to squares, and squares don't understand. Like, you know, if you want to live that square life, where they don't understand what we talked about before, with even the fact that when you are driving around with your boyfriend, you're not going to be listening to regular music, you're going to be listening to sugar free and all this that talks about the life. So it's ingrained to brainwash you to believe like this is normal, like this is the normal things that we would do. And they don't understand, well, you know, I'm going to come home with my wifey, and my pimp's going to make us take all of our money out, and then he's going to pit us against each other because she made more than me, and I should have known better, or I should have made more. And people don't understand that, and that fear, right? And also that still dysfunction of just wanting the leader to love you, right? Because they're feeling this void, like I need him to have this connection with me. So I think it's so important. And I also told Jamie, what I love about the Avery Center too is it is based on research, because I think a lot of times stuff comes out and I don't really know where it comes from when it pertains to human trafficking, but and also how critical it is, because there is no accurate. It's always interesting to me that a lot of nonprofits are funded by data-driven presentations that they put in their grant writing, right? But there's actually no accurate, really, data, because a lot of, and even from different states and legislators, they pick and choose how they want to see victims. And proof in that is your lunch meeting, because she wanted to see a victim a certain way, and unfortunately our laws are built like that too, in many places, where they're not getting identified because they don't meet a certain checkbox, and then there's no data. So I love that about the Avery Center too, that it is based in research. I think that's really important for the human trafficking movement in general.
Yes. Oh, Liz, you are my people.
Something that you both brought up that, Megan, I'm hoping you can unpack a little bit more. Liz mentioned this idea of going back to the victim just really looking for that love and acceptance from their trafficker. And you referenced trauma bonds really briefly. Can you talk about that a little bit more?
Sure.
We talk in the class overall about how all human beings have the same set of needs. And when we don't have these needs met in healthy ways, it lends ourselves to being vulnerable to looking to get these needs met in an unhealthy way. And we know that love and acceptance is one of those really primal needs for human
Mhm.
beings, right? And
It
so we
is.
try to talk about ways for parents to meet that in healthy ways. But can you go into a little bit on the trauma bond?
Sure. Yeah, definitely. And I'd also love to talk about attachment theory, which is something that I'm learning about right now. That I 100% I totally think it feeds back into vulnerabilities for trafficking
Hmm.
and who traffickers target. Um, so trauma bond. So full disclaimer, I am not a mental health professional. I cannot diagnose anybody. I had another colleague of mine, Shauna Parker with Angels Go to Work. She's in Phoenix. But she described this at a conference like a year ago. And I was like, oh my gosh, like I've had a trauma bond and I didn't even know how to like describe it.
Yeah.
But she did such a good job of describing it. So a trauma bond is essentially like a chemical addiction to your abuser. And so you have two pieces. You have your stress hormones, so cortisol, and you have your bonding hormones like oxytocin. And they're both being released at the same time or like one after the other.
Yeah.
So you may experience, and this is the same thing with interpersonal violence and domestic violence, right? So that power and control in the cycle of abuse. So you have this honeymoon period of being showered with gifts and affection and words of affirmation and spending time, all of those things, you're releasing these bonding hormones. You're sharing meals together, you're riding in the car together. This is all positive, happy, feel good. Your body physically feels good when those hormones are being released.
Mhm.
And then you have this trauma piece. So you have physical abuse, assault, verbal abuse, emotional abuse, financial abuse, all forms of abuse that are happening concurrently. And so when you have those stress hormones and those bonding hormones that are being released at the same time, they combine and create a physical chemical dependency on your abuser. And so those questions that like we've heard for decades, we've heard them our whole lives, of well, why did she just go back to him? Why did they just go back to their abuser? Well, there's a lot of factors at play. There
Yeah.
may be a financial dependent piece. There could be children involved. There's all kinds of things, but there's also this trauma bond where your body starts to crave that chaos cycle that your abuser has created for you. And so when you leave a trafficker or any type of an abuser, your body has to go through withdrawals and detox from that relationship. And I find that so fascinating. And
Um,
it's so important to understand that you can be physically addicted to a person or to a relationship. But I also think that you see that trauma bond. So maybe there isn't a third party trafficker. Maybe somebody's engaging in prostitution or commercial sex out of a need for survival.
mhm.
But that culture and that lifestyle also creates this trauma bond. So Elizabeth, sounds like you've worked with victims and survivors, so you're probably familiar with the term like I'm addicted to the game, like I just can't get
Right.
out, the money keeps calling me. And that's ultimately what's happening. You're trauma bonded to this environment and to these experiences where you do get money and you get compliments and so you feel good, and then you experience assaults and robberies and substance use and all of these things, and so you're releasing stress hormones too, and so then boom, you have this trauma bond. It's really hard to leave when it's like impossible to leave when you have that chemical addiction in your body to that environment or that person.
Because our brains and our body seeks out the familiar. So even if the
Yes.
familiar is toxic or unhealthy,
Hmm.
we are creatures of habit and we seek out
Yep.
repeating patterns. Liz and I right now are both reading the holistic psychologist's new book that just came out, Dr. Nicole LaPera, How to Do the Work. And she goes into this idea of being addicted to our emotions and seeking out experiences that will create that chemical hit inside of our body.
Hmm.
And that's essentially what you just described. So thank you for elaborating on that a bit more. And I'm sure that this idea is also going to come up in our future conversation that we're having with you, where you're going to be going through the stages of change and what
Yes.
a victim might expect to experience in their transition or in their efforts to leave the life or the game, right?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it all ties together.
Yeah. All the dots connect somewhere.
Yes,
And
yes,
that's
they
what
do.
we're here to do. We're trying to connect the dots to help this make sense for everybody. So Megan, thank you so much for speaking to us on that. I think it's going to be really eye-opening for a lot of people. So I guess I should have told them before we started this video, make sure you get out your pen and paper. You might want to jot down some notes, but luckily they'll be able to pause and rewind and go back as needed. So thank you again so much. And we look forward to speaking with you coming up here soon on our next topic. Thank you, Miss Liz, for your contributions. And we'll see you soon, everybody. Take care of yourselves. Thank you.